Our first presenter will be Logan. He's a PhD candidate at Wright State University. He'll be presenting on the very hungry caterpillars, how our native lepidopterans respond to invasive plant species. So we'll connect his laptop here and he'll do the first presenter. Let's welcome Logan.
All right, well, first of all, thank you to the Five Rivers Metro Parks for having me here and also for supporting this research through various permits that they've given to our lab over the years. So a lot of the research that they're talking about in the latter part of this presentation is actually performed in the Metro Parks, which is pretty cool. So this is a portion of the sort of master's thesis that I just wrapped up, titled "The Responses of Insect Herbivores and Local Food Webs to Invasive Shrubs." There's a lot of sort of there's a lot of recent research that has been done on invasive plants, but one of the areas that's really sort of unstudied is their impact on local food webs. So that's sort of one of the research gaps that I'm attempting to address here. So just briefly, I'm going to outline the presentation just to sort of clarify things. So first, I'm just going to give just a basic overview about caterpillar diversity and importance in local ecosystems. Then I'm going to talk a little bit in general about invasive plant species and some about their impacts. Then I'm going to give some examples of some caterpillar responses to invasive plants and talk about how caterpillars might respond to invasive plants adaptively. And then I'm actually going to get into my project, which is the responses of caterpillars to Amur, honeysuckle, and autumn olive in our local and natural areas. So most of us have probably seen those plants, even if we don't realize, but some of us probably actually recognize those names. They're very common. So section 1, caterpillar diversity and importance. So first, what is a caterpillar? So broadly speaking, caterpillars are just the larvae of the insects of the order Lepidoptera, which are our moths and our butterflies. So essentially, they're just moth and butterfly larvae. They come in a wide variety of forms, everything from something pretty cryptic, trying to look like a stick, to something which is looking like something that you don't want to touch with a red and white stripe. They can be anywhere from from so small that you need a magnifying glass to see them, all the way up to about as big around as your thumb and 3 or 4 inches long in some of the cases of our big Saturday silk moths. That one specifically, I believe, is pretty toxic if you touch it. Like you'll get like a rash. It's not going to kill you or anything, but just try not to touch. Just try not to touch those. So when we think about lepidopterans, the moths and the butterflies, I think usually we hear about butterflies. But even though they're the ones we sort of hear about and see about and see a lot about, they actually only represent one small sort of weird day-flying moth lineage of the lepidopterans. The vast majority of them are moths. We have about 140 species of butterfly in Ohio and 3,000 moth species, and probably a lot more that haven't been identified. Because a lot of these look similarly enough. You could have a 200 or 300 page book full of moths that more or less look the same, unless you're trying to identify them for some sort of scientific project. So why do we care about caterpillars? They're really important herbivores, particularly around here in forests. They probably represent most of the herbivory that we see on the leaves out there. So if you see a chunk missing out of a leaf, if it wasn't clearly from something like a deer, it can probably be attributed to caterpillars or perhaps to beetles. There's some herbivores to that. But because of this, they're really important for energy transfer in food webs. That is, the plants grow, the insects eat the plants, and everything else eats the insects. So if we didn't have the insects, if we didn't have caterpillars and insects to the same degree, the ecosystem wouldn't be able to support mammals and birds to the same extent that we ought to. They're really important pollinators, both of lots of our native species. Some of our native species are pollinated by a couple specific species of moth and butterfly, but they're also really important in certain sects of agriculture. And I would also answer this question with a question, which is, do we need a reason? I mean, they are they're living beings. They're really cool, and we don't necessarily need any sort of like economic or real world reason why we should care about them. So these 2 points in particular, the fact that they are the dominant herbivores in deciduous forests, and that they're really important for energy transfer and food web. These are two sort of important points to my project and just something to increase the impact. So next, just a little bit about invasive species and their impacts. These are some of the invasive species that we might be familiar with. Autumn olive, garlic mustard, antelope ash borer, zebra mussel, spotted lanternfly, increasing life. I believe that some of these have been found in this part of Ohio. I actually had someone tell me that they found one the other day in the Dayton area, so that's not something that I'm particularly looking forward to. But invasive species broadly are just defined as any non-native species or introduced species which causes some sort of environmental or economic harm. So something like the banana tree you have planted in your backyard or the honeybee, even though these things are non-native, they're not proliferating wildly and causing damage to ecosystems or causing some sort of economic damage. So even though they're not native, they're also not invasive. And by some definitions, humans would actually be considered invasive, but it also sort of depends on the definition that you use, because we're sort of spreading ourselves, and animals that spread themselves, we don't usually consider that invasion, but it depends on how natural you consider that process. But anyway, just something sort of interesting about Homo sapiens. So invasive plant species and invasive species in general are really a human-caused issue. Human activity has accelerated the establishment and spread of these species through things like accidental transport. I believe spotted lanternfly first came to the United States in a box of rock. No one knew it was there until it's everywhere. Some species are purposefully introduced. This is in the bottom right corner. Bottom right corner is it Amur honeysuckle or Logan, which was introduced as an ornamental. Autumn olive was also introduced as an ornamental, but they spread wildly. And the disturbed environments which we create along with fragmentation also promote the spread of these invaders. But it's not just that they're out there in increasing density. They're also causing some pretty serious issues. Specifically, which is honeysuckle shown there, and a lot of other species have been shown to reduce the abundance and richness of native plants more than sort of ecologically similar native plants would. They cause about between $100 and $200 billion in economic costs, mostly through land use change and damage. And they also might have limited contributions to food webs. That is, if you have native plants that are displaced by the invasive plants, if the invasive plants aren't consumed by the insect community to sort of a similar level, then there aren't as many insects and as many birds and aren't as many animals. So it's a pretty serious issue. Sort of in the field, we would sort of refer to that as like enemy release. So when an invasive plant leaves its native range, when honeysuckle came out of Asia, it also left behind all its herbivores, all the things that were used to eating it, all the things that had evolved along with it, that were evolved to it. So all of its specialists were left behind. It came here, and the insect community might not know what to do with it. Therefore, it was released from herbivory and not contributing to the food web. So, section 3, the actual caterpillar responses to invasive plants. I think I have like a comment here. I'm going to work here. Yeah. Okay. So imagine that you are a caterpillar. You're part of a caterpillar community. Your species has a group of plants that it's been feeding on, or a plant or a group of plants that it's been feeding on for a millennium. You're adapted to eat it. You're adapted to recognize it. The adult females, which would be the moths and butterflies in this case, they're familiar with how the plant smells and how it feels, and they know that it's a good place to lay its eggs. So what happens when the ecosystem turns into this? Invasive plants dominate. So the invasive plants have become dominant. Herbivores are still feeding on the native plants, but there just aren't as many of them. So the invasive plants aren't experiencing that same herbivory. They don't have the pressure. The insects aren't eating them. They can put more of their energy into spreading, which just makes them even more invasive. But sort of light at the end of the tunnel here is something that we refer to as ecological assimilation, which is that, so as the ecosystem is dominated by these plants, the insects are eventually going to come into contact with it. The female lays the eggs on the plant, the larva hatch, the caterpillars try to eat it. And the longer that this sort of process happens where the insects interact with it, they should start to develop evolutionary adaptations towards using the native plants in a similar way that they use the natives. So the plants become integrated into the food web and ecologically assimilated as the time since invasion increases. And the jury is still out on how long this takes. I mean, there's some papers and some suggestion that this could take a couple hundred years, but there's also some evidence that says for certain species it could be 20 or 30 years. And insects, the generation time can be pretty short. Some of these moths and butterflies can have 2 or 3 generations per year, so that can allow for some pretty rapid evolution compared to how we typically think about it. Evolutionary timescales tend to operate on really sort of long levels. So now getting into the specifics of my project that was recently wrapped up, responses of insect herbivores and local food webs to invasive shrubs. So I mentioned these shrubs earlier, but these are 2 invasive shrubs that are super prevalent in our natural areas, and we sort of chose these as study systems. They're both from the sort of Eastern Asian area. They look kind of similar. They both have bright red berries. The leaf shape is pretty similar. They thrive in similar habitats. These things like to be on like the edge of forests. You might find some out in the open or some penetrating a little bit into forests, but generally these are edge dominant species. And despite the fact that they look pretty similar, they're actually not like closely related at all. There are species that are more closely related to these that are native than these are to each other, but they were just chosen just generally because they're just so densely populated in our ecosystems. So my overarching hypothesis was that insect herbivore populations are colonizing invasive shrubs and integrating them into their diets, ecologically assimilating them in a way that would be sort of consistent with evolutionary adaptation having occurred. So if this ecological assimilation is occurring, we expect it to find more abundant and diverse communities on invasive plants located in more exposed areas. That is, if we have 2 areas, one of which the density of these plants is very high, and the second area where the density of these plants is either non-existent or very low. The insect communities living in the area with lots of invasive plants have been exposed to it. It's been there for longer. It's had the chance to proliferate. And as such, those insects have also had the chance to adapt to it. They have both the time and the exposure to the plant necessary for adaptation. So those communities should be more abundant and diverse in those areas that have had a chance to adapt. We also expect to find greater herbivory on invasives in more exposed areas for exactly the same reason. The insect communities that are in those areas that have been exposed to the plant for longer should be able to eat the plant more and should experience greater herbivory than in the areas where there's not very much of the plant. So just to sort of further clarify these predictions, on a native plant between an area with a lot of the invasive and an area with not a lot of the invasive, we wouldn't really expect to find much of a difference. But for the invasive plant, in the area, we call this the naive region, the naive insect community, we would expect the exposed region to host plants with more abundance and richness, or more insect abundance and richness on the caterpillars. It's when I say insects in the actual methods, I'm talking about caterpillars. This is the study system that we chose. So in order to do this, I needed to find 2 areas that match these criteria in Ohio. So for my exposed region with lots of these plants, they've been here for a long time, I chose the Miami Valley region, which is right around here. For the unexposed region, or the naive region, I chose Western Appalachia, which is actually where I'm from. These plants are actually pretty difficult to locate here in some cases, and if you find them, usually they're not present in a very high density, or they're present in a high density but in very small pockets. They're not widespread in the same way that they are in the Miami Valley. So what do we actually do in each of these 2 regions? So we use beat sheet surveys to collect abundance and richness data. And what that looks like is you take a sheet that's on basically a frame, you hold it underneath the bush, and you beat the bush with a stick, hence beat sheet. So you get some awful funny looks when you're walking around the state park and you're beating bushes with a stick, but it's good fun. So anyway, you have your sheet, you have your insects from the bush on it, and you count how many there are, or you count how many caterpillars there are, and you also mark down how many species that you see. Which sort of leads me into the next step, which is laboratory rearing. So a lot of these, finding them in the field and looking at a book or looking online is not enough to identify them. We actually have to bring these caterpillars back to the lab, rear them on the plant which they were found, And then once they pupate and then emerge to adulthood, we use a combination of photos that we've taken of the caterpillar with the adult specimen that we have, and that is usually sufficient to identify the adaptive species. So we're able to be pretty confident about our identifications, but it does require this sort of long process where we get the caterpillar, we raise it for possibly a couple months. But usually they don't take that long, but we've had some struggles. So the last thing that we did was collect leaves and do an herbivory analysis. So this is essentially just we pick a collection of leaves off of plants. You look at them, you use software programs to analyze how much of the material is missing, and then that's your herbivory. Average over thousands and thousands of leaves. Yeah. So now into the actual data. There's a lot going on here, and I'll sort of try to break it down. It's essentially 3 different graphs all forced into one, so it's sort of confusing to look at it before. But this is the caterpillar abundance data per cubic meter. So when we would do these samples, we would also measure how many cubic meters of foliage were in each sample, which allows us to do abundance per cubic meter. So this is separated by both region and plant. So each plant has its own graph with 2 different points. 1 point for abundance within the exposed region, which is here, and 1 point for abundance unexposed. Unexposed region is here. Exposed region is from Appalachia. So there's 1 point for each of those on each graph. And the important comparison here is not necessarily from plant to plant, but since we're trying to look at single plants, but between the 2 regions because of the whole exposed region, unexposed region for the invasive species. So starting on the left with sugar maple, the unexposed region hosts more caterpillars than the exposed region. So there are more caterpillars on sugar maple here than there are in the other region. It's the exact same trend for autumn olive. There are more caterpillars here than there are in the exposed region.
Hey, this is the exposed region, right?
Yeah.
The Miami Valley. Yeah.
Oh, so I did say it right. Okay, sorry. I apologize. We are in the exposed region. So in Appalachia, caterpillars are more abundant on sugar maple. In Appalachia, caterpillars are more abundant on autumn olive. And the caterpillars being more abundant on sugar maple is sort of something that we expected because sugar maple was added as a native plant comparison. The other 2 were invasive. Sugar maple is native. And we wanted to know, like, well, are the caterpillar communities in the different places just generally different and not different on just the invasive plants? Because, I mean, if that's the case, it would obscure this data. Which is, that ended up sort of being what we found. That both the data for sugar maple and on autumn olive both suggested that the general caterpillar community in the unexposed region, which is Appalachia, is just generally greater. But the interesting thing is that we found the exact opposite trend on honeysuckle. In the exposed region, which is here, we saw a more abundant caterpillar community. The exact opposite trend from the strong trends we saw in the previous 2 graphs, which suggests that in spite of a generally much greater community in Appalachia, that some sort of adaptation or some sort of interaction allows the exposed region to have more in the unexposed region for honeysuckle here. So that's sort of, even though they look pretty close together and they're not statistically different, just the difference in trend here is suggestive that there is some sort of adaptation occurring in the exposed region. So this is a very similar graph, which actually shows something completely different. This is the herbivory graph, meaning on the x-axis we have mean herbivory damage, and then everything else is pretty much the same. We're separated by both plant and region. There's 1 graph for each plant, just separated either into unexposed or exposed. So both sugar maple and autumn olive, between the 2 regions, they are not actually very different. They're pretty similar. But what's interesting about sugar maple and autumn olive is when you compare plant to plant, autumn olive actually has significantly higher herbivory than sugar maple, which is not necessarily what we'd expect under the enemy release hypothesis, which is that the invasive plant should have lower herbivory than the native plant because the native plant has all these specialist herbivores, all the herbivores are co-evolved. So it's actually pretty unusual to find that herbivory is so high on autumn olive compared to sugar maple. And sort of the same as with the previous graph, there's something pretty different going on with Amur honeysuckle, which is, I just never remember this. So here the difference is striking. The exposed region, the plants in the exposed region experience much more herbivory than plants in the unexposed region, which once again supports the hypothesis that there's some sort of adaptation towards eating these plants occurring on the insect populations in the exposed region, which is here. So this is, once again, something completely different. The form of this graph is very different. These are species accumulation curves. So what we do is we put the species richness, which is just the total number of species we found on each plant, and the total number of cubic meters of foliage sampled for each region plant combination into a statistical model. And what it does is it plots up to the point where our data stops with our actual data. And then after you get past that, you go into the line that isn't dotted, the solid line. It's using a statistical model to extrapolate out. So I know that I sampled 175 cubic meters and I found about 30 species. What this is telling me is that how many species would I have found if I had sampled 300? So it extrapolates out. And for autumn olive, we see that it's not really different. The confidence intervals overlap, which is just the sort of shaded sections. So it's probably not different between these two areas. But for honeysuckle, once again, for the third time, it actually is different. The Miami Valley region has more species, according to both our data and extrapolated out by the accumulation curve, than the unexposed Western Appalachian region, which once again supports the hypothesis that in the exposed Miami Valley region, these plants are being assimilated into the food web. So in summary, is ecological assimilation occurring? Okay, so those are the scientific names. Logan Mackii, L. Mackii is Amur honeysuckle, L. Symbolata is autumnala, and Easter saccharum is sugar. Logan Mackii hosts a more abundant enriched community in the exposed region, which supports our hypothesis. L. Symbolata has similar herbivory to Easter saccharum, and Logan Mackii has significantly less. This is, a pretty striking result. It doesn't really relate to the ecological assimilation hypothesis, but it is really interesting and kind of unique that Elaeagnus umbellata gets so much herbivory. And there could be several reasons for this. It's possible that its leaves are just very nutritious and that just attracts caterpillars. It's also possible that some sort of ecological assimilation has already occurred. That timeline is unclear. But herbivory generally being greater in the exposed region, but only significantly so for honeysuckle, Logan Mackii, also supports the hypothesis that ecological assimilation is occurring. So to summarize, competitive advantage conferred invasive plants by enemy release probably decreases over time. As insects adapt to eat them, more things eat them, and they sort of reach a similar level of herbivory as the native plants. So they're both experiencing the same pressure, and they can't use that to sort of get a jump on native plants. Assimilation to the food web may be occurring or have occurred over time by that same process. And on long temporal scales, as the adaptation sort of equalizes native and invasive plants, the invasive plants will probably just become functionally indistinguishable from natives. I mean, at one point, everything was invasive. I mean, there are probably some species that are just endemic to this region for close to its entire history, but I mean, at one point, everything immigrated into this area and would have been considered invasive. So even though Amur honeysuckle is autumnala, are known to negatively impact diversity, in the long term, these plants will likely support dependent insect communities and the greater food web.
So you were saying mostly the butterflies and moths, caterpillars, and a lot of times when I think about those, I think about them being very host specific on which plants they use. Was this kind of more general moth species or butterfly species, or did you see any differences with maybe some that are more rare or more specialized in your results?
So most of what we found, the vast majority were generalists. There are a lot of moth and, I guess mainly moth caterpillars that will eat, any number of hundreds of plants. So most of those species were what we found. For instance, on maple, some of the caterpillars we found were specialists, like the rosy maple moth and things like that. But on the invasives, it was for the most part generalists. But there were some things, you wouldn't necessarily expect to find on invasives. For instance, the IO moth was from honeysuckle. I should note that it did not actually survive degradation.
Wait, can you go to your first results graph? Yeah. Okay, so it doesn't look like there's a big difference between autumn olive and sugar maple in terms of like the abundance of caterpillars. So that even though autumn olive is invasive and sugar maple isn't.
Yeah, that was sort of surprising throughout all the results. I don't have the richness data up here, but it was also similar in terms of herbivory abundance and richness. They were statistically indistinguishable. I don't have that measurement up here, but it was a test that we did.
To get the sugar maple data, did you just do like saplings and stuff and like once, or did you climb a tree and shake a big branch?
That is a good question. So if you look, actually I took the graph off, but the sample size for sugar maple was much smaller than the sample size for the rest because really we were only able to sample the branches that hang down, which sort of represents another issue because the insect community on trees changes as you go up into the canopy. So by sampling the lower branches, we did actually bias our science, but yeah.
I'm just kind of curious on that slide before that, like back to where Dr. Steierman was looking at, where you said that you didn't have the species richness on here, but after doing the work, I was just kind of curious, since you were the one actually looking at, did you notice a biodiversity difference between sugar maple and autumn olive? Like, were they all the same caterpillar, for an example, on autumn olive versus sugar maple?
So the communities that we found on these, like there was some overlap between autumn olive and sugar maple in the generalist community, but like there was the several specialist species that were all on sugar maple. But yeah, there's a lot of overlap in those communities.
Does the fact that the honeysuckle produces such like sweet nectar and flowers that could attract butterflies have any impact in sort of attracting more butterflies and moths to these plants to lay their eggs on?
Yeah, it's possible that could bring them into the area. I mean, the moths a lot of them feed in a similar way as to butterflies, where they go around the flowers at night and they get nectar. So
are they as specialist as the caterpillars? Or butterflies and moths, they just do more general any plant?
I think it's highly species dependent. Like there are species of moth that are just on one species of plant. I think with butterflies there are several really sort of very very popular examples like the monarch. But yeah, those also exist in the moth community.
Can you remind me what the P number is and how that's calculated?
Sure. So the p-value in these. It's a statistical test that determines whether or not there's a difference between two groups of data. These were actually, I believe the p-values on these, it was a bunch of different tests that I'm making these figures, but I think these are log-rank p-values. But, so a p-value equal to or lower than 0.05 indicates statistical significance at a 95% level, or an alpha value of 0.05. Yeah, so like something like 0.06 wouldn't technically be considered significant, but it's close enough that we would probably talk about it like it is significant. So we'd say like marginally significant. But even like a p-value of like 0.1 or 0.15, like would still indicate a pretty strong trend. But the 5% is a pretty stringent regulation, especially in ecology data where we have all sorts of variation that we can't really count on.
What's kind of the absolute numbers of caterpillars you're looking at here?
So total sample size, I believe there were about between 400 and 450 caterpillars total were found over the course of the field season, most of which were brought back in regional lab.
And how many trees were you pulling them off of?
So the total number of samples, this is a crazy Excel sheet.
Ish.
I think that we were looking at somewhere in the round of like 600 or 700 samples. Because we found an average of a couple caterpillars per plant. So,
Yeah, just curious because I'm trying to conceptualize because sugar maple, especially full grown, is a different structural. It's bigger, right, than autumn olive, and so I'm trying to capture that in the midst of all your data and trying to fully understand your project.
What did you do with all of the moths?
so the moths, usually what happens is they get frozen, and then they're spread on a spreading board, and then they're prepared as entomological specimens. And sort of building the collection of the moths that we have in this area over the years allows us to more easily identify moths in the future. For instance, if I have a moth, I'm not quite sure what it is, I'm stuck between two species, I go and I pull 10 species each of ones I know that are those species from our collection, and I look and I compare. Yeah, so it is sort of unfortunate, but it also sort of necessary.
I should note that sometimes so we do let go and do what they are with display.
Especially like the nice big like Saturnian moths, like we almost always let those go.
Have you considered like doing spice bush, like a native bush that might have been the same size as the autumn olive, so it was more of a direct comparison?
Yeah, so that was definitely something we considered. Sugar maple was chosen specifically because there's some literature that says that it's like a good, like medium quality host. Like it's not great, it's not bad.
Yeah.
There's a decent amount of stuff on it, so it's
Okay.
just sort of like a good middle range comparison. But spice bush would also be good, and maybe in some ways better because it's so ecologically similar. But I mean, it also like it's spice bush. It smells funny. It has like funny compounds, so like maybe that could have an effect. It's also so.
Well, thank you.